The front desk stayed exactly as I'd left it, and the security cameras showed no signs of movement anywhere in the building. I saw it when I walked around the front desk though. Check on the salt line. Muddy footprints led from the elevator across the burgundy carpet, clearly visible in the lobby's bright lighting. They were large prints, bigger than any guest's shoes I'd seen, and they went directly from the elevator doors toward the stairwell. I followed the prints up the stairs, my flashlight beam shone theatrical as it continued to the third floor. The muddy tracks led down the hallway to room 371, where they stopped suddenly at the door. There were no return prints, no sign of how whoever had made them had left the area. According to the computer system, no guests were registered on the third floor at all. Room 371 stayed empty and bookable just as it was supposed to. The other rooms on that floor were vacant, their doors closed and locked. But someone, or something, had walked from the elevator to room 371 during those 8 minutes. When the camera showed only static, I went back to the lobby and checked the salt line, which stayed perfectly intact. Whatever had left those muddy footprints, it hadn't needed to cross the barrier near the entrance. It had gotten into the building through some other way, possibly through the elevator itself. The rest of the night passed in tense watching. I couldn't concentrate on studying, couldn't stop thinking about those purposeful footsteps, and the direct trail leading to the one room I wasn't supposed to book. Every sound made me look up from my textbook. Every movement outside their glass doors caught my attention. I felt watched throughout the entire shift, like something was watching me from the building's shadowy corners. When Rebecca arrived at 7 a.m., I had already mopped up the muddy footprints and returned the building to its normal appearance. I didn't mention the prints or the howling or the drunk guest's encounter with the non-responsive elevator. Instead, I gathered my things and headed home, carrying with me the growing certainty that the Grandview Hotel was far more dangerous than I had initially understood. The historical search had provided context, but it had also confirmed my worst suspicions. The hotel wasn't just strange, it was predatory, and whatever had claimed Mr. Calhoun was now turning its attention toward me. I sat in my car outside the Grandview Hotel for 10 minutes before my fourth shift, staring at the building's brick front and wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. Their search from the library had painted a clear picture of what this place really was, and James Wilson's warning about Mr. Calhoun's fate bounced around in my mind every time I looked at those glass doors. But I needed this job, and more than that, I needed to understand what had happened to the previous night manager. Something told me that walking away now wouldn't solve the problem. It would just leave the next person completely unprepared for what waited inside. Rebecca met me at the front desk with her usual professional manner, but I caught her looking toward the elevator. More than once while she told me about the night's maintenance requests. A second-floor guest had complained about scratching sounds in the walls, and the coffee maker on the third floor had broken again. She left these details on a sticky note attached to the computer monitor, along with a reminder that James would handle any serious issues in the morning. Everything quiet otherwise? I asked, settling into the desk chair as she gathered her things. As quiet as it gets here. Rebecca paused at the door, her hand on the brass handle. Dylan, you've been doing well with the night shift protocols. Keep following them exactly as written. All right? Don't try to be creative with the rules. The way she sized the word exactly made my skin crawl. Rebecca knew more than she let on about what those rules were really protecting against, but she'd clearly decided that ignorance was the safer option. I watched her disappear into the parking lot, leaving me alone with the hotel's silence and my growing collection of unanswered questions. By midnight, I'd managed to complete 2 chapters of reading for my political science class, but my attention kept drifting to the office behind me. Mr. Calhoun had worked from that same desk for 2 years, long enough to develop his defensive protocols through what must have been a series of increasingly dangerous encounters. He'd been methodical about everything else. Surely, he'd left more detailed records somewhere beyond the laminated rule sheet. At 12:30 a.m., curiosity finally overcome caution. I locked the front door and carried my textbook into the office, settling into the worn desk chair that had been Mr. Calhoun's workspace. The desk itself was standard hotel furniture, probably installed when the building opened, with 3 drawers on the right side and a larger file drawer at the bottom. Rebecca had cleared out any personal items after his disappearance, but she might have missed something important. The top 2 drawers contained typical office supplies, pens, paper clips, a stapler that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The file drawer held maintenance requests dating back several months, along with staff schedules and vendor contact information. Nothing unusual, nothing that explained Mr. Calhoun's growing paranoia or his sudden disappearance. I was about to give up when I noticed that the bottom drawer seemed shallower than it should be compared to the others. Running my fingers along the inside back panel, I found a small gap where the wood didn't quite meet the drawer's frame. Pressure in the right spot caused the panel to move, revealing a hidden compartment just large enough to hold a small notebook. The leather-bound book was maybe 5x7 and filled with Mr. Calhoun's precious handwriting. The first entry was dated 2 months after he'd started the job, and the final entry was from the night before his disappearance. As I looked through his notes, a chill settled over me that had nothing to do with the office's temperature. Month 3, Week 2. The elevator responds to commands during day hours, but becomes selective after 11 p.m. Watch drunk guests. Press call button repeatedly with no response. Then saw doors open immediately when I tested it myself. Building is enforcing the overnight restrictions automatically. Month 4, Week 1. Third guest this month has reported hotel employees encouraging rule violations. Descriptions don't match any suspect the entities can mimic human appearance to some degree using familiarity to lower defenses. Month 6, Week 3. Confirmed that room 371 serves as primary anchor point. Electromagnetic. Readings spiked dramatically near that door during overnight hours. Salt line isn't just symbolic. It creates genuine barrier that prevents full manifestation in lobby area. Month 8, Week 2. Charlie Brennan disappeared last night after ignoring warnings about elevator use. Security footage shows him entering at 2:47 a.m. but never exiting. Elevator was empty when I checked at 6 a.m. Whatever these entities are, they're actively recruiting. Page after page detailed Mr. Calhoun's growing understanding of the hotel's supernatural ecosystem. The entities weren't random haunts. They were. Dad had learned to use the building as a hunting ground. They needed people to break the protective areas willingly. And they developed sophisticated strategies for manipulation and deception. Charlie hadn't just been fired for drinking. He'd been claimed by something that now wore his appearance to lure others into violating the rules. The final entries became increasingly desperate as Mr. Calhoun described feeling pulled toward the elevator during the 313 to 321 window. He'd started hearing voices calling his name from inside the shaft, promising answers to his questions about Hoto's history. The last entry was barely legible, written in shaken handwriting that suggested he'd been struggling to maintain control. They know I understand too much. Every night the pull gets stronger. Tonight I heard multiple voices, other night managers, who disappeared over the years. They're all in there in whatever space exists beyond the elevator doors. I can feel them trying to draw me in. If I'm not here tomorrow, someone needs to know. The rules aren't enough. The barriers are weakening. They're learning to work around the protections. I closed Zeph's notebook with hands that weren't entirely steady. Mr. Calhoun hadn't quit or had a breakdown. He'd been systematically targeted by entities that viewed him as a threat to their feeding ground. And now I was following the same path, asking the same questions, discovering the same terrible truths. The security monitor in the corner of the office had been cycling through different camera feeds while I looked through the notebook, showing empty hallways and vacant common areas. But something about the footage nagged at me, a sense that I was missing important details. I pulled up the archived recordings from the past few weeks, focusing on the overnight hours when most of the had occurred. What I found made my stomach drop. The footage from 3 weeks ago showed a guest entering the elevator at 1:15 a.m., clearly violating the first rule. The camera captured him pressing the call button and stepping inside when the doors opened, but the elevator never moved. At 117, the doors opened again to reveal an empty car. The guest had simply vanished during a 2-minute elevator ride to nowhere. 5 days later, a woman had ignored the 1 a.m. curfew. Wandering the lobby at 2:30 a.m., the cameras tracked her move. She approached the stairwell door. The moment she touched the handle, the feed dissolved into static for exactly 30 seconds. When the image cleared, the lobby was empty. She never appeared on any other camera, never returned to her room, never checked out the next morning. Chart appeared in multiplayer recordings, but his behavior was impossible according to normal physics. He would materialize outside the glass doors without walking into frame, disappear mid-conversation without moving away, and sometimes appear simultaneously on cameras from different floors. In one particularly disturbing skance he stood outside the lobby, while his reflection in the glass doors showed a completely different appearance, translucent with eyes that were completely black. I scrolled through hours of footage, finding incident after incident that the day staff had apparently never noticed or had chosen to ignore. Guests who broke rules disappeared without explanation. Figures appeared in locations that should have been empty. The elevator operated on its own. opening and closing its doors in patterns that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical malfunction. The clock showed 3:10 a.m. when I realized I'd been so absorbed in the recordings that I'd almost missed the mandatory isolation period. It quickly saved the footage I'd been reviewing and settled back in the desk chair, bracing myself for another 8 minutes of supernatural activity. The howling began at 3:13, louder than I had been on previous nights. The sound seemed to emerge from multiple directions at once, creating a chorus of inhuman voices that made the office walls vibrate. But tonight, underneath the mechanical wailing, I could hear something else. Human voices calling from somewhere deep in the building. Dylan. My name echoed from the direction of the elevator shaft, spoken in a voice I didn't recognize. But that carried the desperate urgency of someone calling for help. The voice was muffled as though it came from a great distance, or through some kind of barrier. Dylan, don't let them take you to Dot. This voice was different. Older, more authoritative. It could have been Mr. Calhoun. Thought distortion made identification impossible. The sound seemed to come from inside the elevator shaft itself, from whatever space existed beyond the doors during these 8 important minutes. We tried to warn people. We tried to maintain the barriers, but they're getting stronger. More voices joined in, overlapping until I couldn't tell individual words apart. They seemed to be calling from different levels of the building. Some close and urgent, others distant and carrying through the halls. The howling grew louder, drowning out the human voice somehow. Only that mechanical wailing remained. At 3:21, the sound stopped suddenly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat in the office for several more minutes, listening for any sign that the voices might start up again, but the building had returned to its normal quiet. The elevator doors were standing open. They'd never opened during previous nights, even with all the sounds coming from the shaft. Now they were wide open like a mouth, showing only darkness beyond the doorway. No light came from inside the car. No reflection showed on the emerald walls. Just pure black emptiness that seemed to move slightly, like something was moving in the depths. I walked toward the elevator carefully, staying several feet away from the opening. The darkness inside wasn't still. It had a flowing quality that suggested depth far beyond what the building's design should have allowed. Looking into that blackness felt like staring into a pit that went much farther than the basement level. From somewhere in that darkness, I heard my name called one more time. The voice was clearer now, more insistent, and it carried a note of desperate pleading that made every instinct scream to step closer and listen. But Mr. Calhoun's note-tape had been very specific about the elevator's true nature, and I'd seen enough security footage to understand what happened to people who entered it during overnight hours. I backed away from the opening on Drayton to the front desk, leaving the elevator doors standing open. After 10 minutes, they closed on their own with their usual mechanical precision, sealing whatever existed beyond them back into the darkness. At 5 a.m., I made my way to the lobby entrance for the required salt line inspection, expecting to find the usual minor breaks that could be easily repaired. Instead, I discovered that the entire barrier had been completely erased. Not disturbed or accidentally broken, but carefully removed along its entire length, leaving no trace of the protective barrier that had kept the entities contained to the upper floors. In place of the salt line, someone, or something, had drawn symbols directly onto the burgundy carpet. The markings were maybe 2 and tall, etched into their fabric with what looked like a sharp instrument. They formed a continuous pattern that ran the same path as the original salt line, but their meaning was completely foreign to me. Their symbols had an angular, aggressive quality that made them uncomfortable to look at directly. I photographed their symbols with my phone before gathering the salt supplies from the storage closet. Following Mr. Calhoun's detailed instructions, I carefully mixed the blessed salt with regular table salt and dappled it in a straight line exactly 3 feet from the entrance. The work was slow and precise, requiring constant attention to ensure the barrier was continuous, and even as I poured the salt mixture over the strange symbols, they seemed to resist being covered. The salt didn't stick properly to the carved areas, sliding away from the markings, like it was being pushed by some invisible force. I had to apply multiple hours working section by section before the symbols were completely hidden beneath the white barrier. By the time Rebecca arrived at 700 a.m., the salt line was restored, and the lobby looked exactly as it should. I'd removed traces of the overnight discrepancies, but I carried with me the growing certainty that the entities were escalating their campaign. They'd marked their territory, claimed their space, and made it clear that the protective barriers were no longer as secure as Mr. Calhoun had believed. The notebook was subtly hidden back in its compartment, but its contents had fundamentally changed my understanding of the situation. I wasn't just working a strange night shift. I was the next target in a predatory cycle that had been repeating for decades. And like Mr. Calhoun before me, I was running out of time to find a solution, before the entities found a way to claim me, too. I spent the next 2 days in my apartmentry, searching protective symbols and ordering supplies online, driven by the growing certainty that the entities were preparing for something bigger than their previous attempts. The carved symbols I'd found, replacing salt line, hadn't appeared in any of my searches, but I'd managed to identify several traditional protective marks that might serve as backup defenses: iron filings, blessed salt from 3 different religious supply companies, and a small container of black salt infused with protective herbs, Ayurvedvia, express shipping, along with a waterproof marker designed for drawing on carpets. My economics textbook remained unopened as I filled notebook pages with research about binding rituals and containment methods. Most of information came from websites that looked questionable at best, but Mr. Calhoun's journal had proved that the supernatural followed certain rules, certain limitations that could be exploited by someone who understood the system. When I arrived at the Grandview Hotel for my 5th shift, I carried a backpack loaded with supplies and a printed folder containing protective symbols I'd found in different cultural trade-ins. Rebecca noticed the extra gear, but didn't comment, simply providing her usual brief update about maintenance requests and guest concerns before disappearing into the parking lot. I sat at the front desk with my materials spread across the marble surface like tools for a job I'd never trained for but somehow inherited. The hotel felt different tonight, more heavy, as though the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of something significant. Even the usual sounds seemed muted, creating an atmosphere of waiting that made my skin crawl. At 11:47 p.m. he checked the salt line and found it intact, but somehow less solid than before. The white barrier looked thinner, more fragile, as though something had been slowly draining its protective properties. I sprinkled additional salt along the entire length, reinforcing the barrier with a blessed mixture I'd prepared according to Mr. Calhoun's detailed instructions. The lobby remained empty until midnight, when Sarah Thompson walked through the glass doors with the same confident stride she displayed on my second night. But this time I was watching for the details Mr. Calhoun's research had taught me to notice. Her footsteps made no sound on the burgundy carpet. Her reflection in the glass doors was subtly wrong, showing clothing that didn't match what she appeared to be wearing, and when she breathed, no fog appeared on the cold night air. "I need room 371, she announced, approaching the front desk with that familiar cold smile. "I believe we've had this conversation before. The room isn't available. It's permanently out of service." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture that suggested barely contained frustration. She placed both hands flat on the marble countertop, and I noticed her fingers were longer than they should be, with joints that bent at unnatural angles. "You don't understand the situation, Dylan. The room belongs to me. It's always belonged to me. I understand perfectly. You're not Sarah Thompson. You're not even human. And you're not getting access to that room." The transformation began slowly, like a mask slipping rather than a sudden change. Her features stayed recognizably human, but became subtly wrong in ways that hurt to look at directly. Her smile stretched too wide, showing teeth that were all canines. Her eyes lost their blue, becoming completely black from corner to corner. When she spoke again, her voice carried sounds that suggested multiple speakers talking in perfect unison. "The barriers are weakening, little guardian. We can feel your fear, tastes, your growing understanding. You know what happened to the man who came before you. You know what waits for all who try to contain us." I reached under the desk for the iron filings I'd prepared, keeping my movements slow and casual. The research had been consistent about iron's protective properties, and I wanted to test the theory before the situation escalated further. "Mr. Calhoun lasted 2 years. I'm planning to do better." Sarah's laugh sounded like glass breaking, sharp and harsh. Her body began to change more dramatically, her size becoming impossible as her arms and legs stretched and her middle governor. The business suit she wore hung loose on a frame that was no longer entirely solid, more like an idea. Real Calhoun thought he could study us, learn our weaknesses. He thought knowledge would protect him. Look where that confidence led. Movement outside the glass doors caught my attention. Charlie stood on the sidewalk, but he'd given up any appearing human. His shape moved between solid and see-through, like a badly tuned television signal. His eyes were completely black, bouncing back the lobby lights like polished stone. When pressed his hands against the glass, they left no prints, and I could see the street behind him through his chest. Sarah followed my look and nodded approvingly. "We're not playing games anymore, Dylan. The feeding ground has been contained too long. Tonight, we reclaim what was always ours. I scattered iron filings across the marble countertop between us, creating a barrier of small metal pieces that sparkled. Under the fluorescent lights, Sarah pulled back immediately, her changed features twisting into an expression of real pain. Where the iron particles came close to her hands, wisps of smoke rose from her skin. Iron hurts, doesn't it? Good to know. The research was accurate. Sarah backed away from the front desk, her form continuing to shift and distort. Her voice became a layered whisper that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. You can't maintain the barriers forever. We are patient. We have waited decades for the right moment. And that moment approaches. The building itself weakens. Your protections draws power from your presence to feed our growing strength. I realized she was right. Each night I'd worked here, the strange incidents had gotten more intense, more direct. The entities weren't just testing Thebe, they were using my presence to somehow weaken them, turning my life force into energy they could use to expand their influence. Charlie had started moving along the glass doors, his see-through body flowing rather than walking. Where he touched the glass, frost patterns shored up and spread, creating detailed designs that hurt to look at directly. The cold seemed to get into the building itself, making the lobby temperature drop several degrees in minutes. The salt line won't hold much longer, Sarah continued, her form now more shadow than substance. We've learned to work around the old protections. Soon we'll clink this entire building, and then we'll spread beyond it. The city has so many potential feeding grounds, so many places where the barriers between worlds grow thin. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight, pointing the bright beam towards Sarah's moving shape. She pulled back again, her outline becoming even less stable in the artificial light. Another useful piece of information. Whatever these things were, they liked darkness and had trouble staying together when directly lit up. You're afraid, I said, keeping the light trained on her retreating figure. Authors talk about reclaiming territory, but you're actually terrified that I might succeed where Mr. Calhoun failed. Sarah's laugh became a shriek that broke one of the lobby's decorative vases, sending ceramic pieces flying across the carpet. Her body disappeared completely for a moment before coming back together several feet away, now more monster than human. Her arms and legs had stretched into something spider-like, and her face was an ugly copy of human features. Fear is for creatures that can die, little guardian. We are beyond such limitations. But you are still beautifully fragile, still bound by the flesh that contains your essence. We will enjoy consuming that essence, adding your voice to our chorus of previous guardians. The lights in Thelaby started to flash, making Sarah's movements look choppy and weird. Charlie had somehow passed through the glass doors without opening them, his see-through body now standing just inside the lobby's entrance. Where his feet touched the salt line, the white barrier started to smoke and break apart. I grabbed the container of blessed salt from my backpack and ran toward the entrance, pouring the mixture frantically along the breaking barrier. The salt made a hissing sound where it ouched Charlie's essence, forcing his body to move back through the glass doors. But the damage was already done. Several feet of the protective line had been broken, creating gaps that would take time to fix properly. The barriers fail. Charlie's voice echoed from outside, multiplying into a chorus of different speakers. The feeding ground opens. The harvest begins. I worked quickly to restore the salt line while keeping the flashlight trained on Sarah's moving body. She had backed away to the far end of the lobby, but hadn't disappeared entirely, staying there like a predator, waiting for an opening. The iron filings on the front desk continued to shine, creating a small, safe zone that neither entity seemed willing to approach directly. Thelaby clock read 3:10 a.m. when I finished repairing the salt line. I had 3 minutes to reach the office before the mandatory isolation period began. But something told me that tonight would be different. The entities were making their coordinated attack now, during their parade, when their power was strongest, and the building's defenses were most weak. I grabbed my supplies and ran forth office, slamming the door just as the clock reached 3:13. But instead of the usual howling from the elevator shaft, I heard the mechanical sound of doors opening on their own. The elevator was operating without being called, its system stress-banding to commands from something that didn't need to press buttons or follow normal procedures. Through the office door, I could hear Sarah's inhuman laughter mixing with Charlie's multiplied voices. They were inside the building now, moving freely through spaces that should have been protected. The isolation period that had kept me safe during previous nights was no longer providing sanctuary. It had become a trap. The computer screen Office blinked and went dark. The security camera monitors turned into static, then displayed images that couldn't be real. The cameras showed the lobby filled with dozens of see-through figures, all of them moving towards the elevator with synchronized purpose. Some wore hotel uniforms from different eras. Others appeared to be guests from various decades. All of them had the same black empty eyes that marked them as claimed by whatever force controlled this building. From the elevator shaft came a sound I'd never heard before. Not howling, human voices calling in desperate harmony. The voices of previous night managers, previous victims, all of them crying out warnings and pleas for help. Among them, clearer than the others, I heard Mr. Calhoun's voice. "Dylan, don't come to the elevator. They're using USA's bait, making us call to you." The darkness inside. It's not just an elevator shaft anymore. It's a feeding space that exists between dimensions, and everyone who enters becomes part of their collective consciousness. I pressed against the office door, listening to the growing chorus of trapped voices. Mr. Calhoun continued speaking, his words barely audible above the others. "They're preparing to expand beyond the building. Room 3071 is just anchor point. The real feeding ground extends through the elevator shaft, into spaces that don't follow normal physical laws. If they claim you, they'll have enough power to spread into the city itself." The voices got louder, more desperate, like the things were making their prisoners call out harder. I could hear my name being said by tons of different people, each one begging me to come to the elevator to help them get out, to join them in whatever they'd been turned into. But under the human voices, I heard something else. A sound like breathing that came from the walls themselves. The building was alive somehow, kept going by the energy it took from people who broke its rules. The Grand View Hotel wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a living thing that ate human life and got stronger with each victim. I checked my phone and saw that only 2 minutes had passed since 3:13. 6 more minutes of this getting worse supernatural attack. 6 more minutes of fighting the huge urge to leave the office and help the voices calling my name. The door handle started to turn by itself, not from outside pressure, but from some force that was controlling the thing directly. The salt line in the lobby was breaking down fast now. He could hear it hissing and crackling as something ate through the protective wall. The iron filings on the front desk were losing their power, their shiny look fading as they were somehow drained of what made them protective. Every defense I'd set up was being torn down by forces that had learned to work around normal protections. At 3:21, the voices stopped suddenly, but the building didn't go back to its normal quiet. Instead, I heard footsteps moving through the lobby. Way too many footsteps, from way too many sources. The things had brought back up, calling out Javori's spirit they'd claimed over the decades, to join in tonight's attack. I waited another 5 minutes before opening the office door, expecting to find the lobby filled with hostile presences. Instead, I found something worse. The space looked completely normal, but felt totally wrong. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, like the pressure had changed. The lobby lights made shadows that moved on their own, and the red carpet showed footprints from dozens of different shoes, all leading toward the elevator. The salt line had been completely destroyed. Not just broken down, but scraped away entirely. In its place, someone had carved new symbols directly into the carpet. Bigger versions of the markings I'd found after me fourth shift. These symbols covered the entire area near the entrance, making a complex pattern that seemed too mauve. When I wasn't looking straight at it, I walked toward the elevator carefully. My flashlight pointed at the closed doors. But as I got closer, the doors opened without being called, showing darkness that was deeper and more complete than anything I'd seen before. The blackness inside moved with purpose, reaching toward the lobby like grabbing fingers. From that darkness, Mr. Calhoun's voice called one final time. "Someone must always guard the hotel. Dylan, leaving means they spread beyond the building. The choice is containment or consumption. There is no escape." The elevator doors closed with mechanical precision, sealing the darkness back into the shaft. But the message was clear. I wasn't just working a night shift anymore. I was the guardian of a supernatural prison responsible for keeping old predators contained within these walls. And if I failed, if I ran like so many others before me, those predators would follow me out into the world. I found the final note at dawn, tucked under the keyboard, where Mr. Calhoun knew I would eventually look. His handwriting was shakier than in the hidden journal written by someone who understood exactly what fate awaited him. "Dylan, the barriers hold only as long as someone maintains them. The hotel needs a guardian, someone who understands the rules and follows them perfectly." I thought I could study them, find a permanent solution. I was wrong. They are patient, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. They will offer you knowledge, power, escape. Accept none of it. Guard the barriers. Maintain the salt. Keep them contained. Someone must always watch. Someone must always stay. Robert Calhoun. I folded the note and put it in my pocket, understanding finally that this job had never been temporary. The Grandview Hotel had claimed me justice, surely as it had claimed Mr. Calhoun. Not through supernatural force, but through moral necessity. I was the only living, standing between these entities in an unsuspecting city, and walking away would make me responsible for every life claimed beyond these walls. I stared at Mr. Calhoun's final note. For several minutes after Rebecca left, someone must always watch. Someone must always stay. He'd accepted that fate for 2 years, keeping up the barriers and containing threats that could spread beyond the building if left unchecked. But containing them wasn't enough no more. The entities had grown too strong, learned too much about working around the protections. Walking away wasn't an option. Even if I could live with abandoning the next night manager to face this alone. The entities had made it clear they were preparing to expand beyond the hotel. Sarah's words from the previous night came back to me. Soon we'll claim this entire building and then we'll spread behind it. They were using the hotel as a base of operations, not just a hunting ground. I spent the first hour of my 6th shift researching binding rituals in my laptop, cross-referencing information from a dozen different websites that dealt with Most of the sources looked questionable, but I'd learned to separate useful information from wishful thinking. The consistent elements across different traditions were simple. Create permanent barriers using materials that disrupted spiritual energy, and redirect that energy back into its source. Iron was mentioned repeatedly as both a barrier and a focusing agent. Salt, create temporary boundaries. But iron could make those boundaries permanent when properly applied. The trick was combining them at the right moment, when the entities were most vulnerable, and their connection to their anchor porous runners. I pulled the container of iron filings from my backpack and mixed them with the blessed salt in a 3-to-1 ratio, following proportions I'd found in an old grimoire, digitized by a university library. The mixture felt different from the standard salt combination. Heavier, more substantial, as though it contained potential energy waiting to be released. By 10 p.m., I had reinforced the lobby's salt line with the iron mixture, creating a bat that looked similar to the original, but felt completely different under my hands. The white powder now had a metallic shine that caught the fluorescent lights. And when I walked across it accidentally, a brief shook ran through my sneakers like static electricity. I arranged additional supplies around the front desk, a second of the iron salt mixture. Mr. Calhoun's hidden notebook opened to his notes about room 371's properties. An A-printed page of binding symbols I'd found in 3 different sources. The symbols were simple geometric patterns, but each one was supposed to redirect spiritual energy in specific ways when drawn with the right materials. Philippi felt different tonight, charged with anticipation that made the air itself seem to vibrate. The Hotel Susula institutional sounds were muted, as though the building was holding its breath before something significant. Even the electrical buzz seemed subdued, creating an atmosphere of waiting that made my skin crawl with nervous energy. At midnight exactly, Sarah Thompson walked through the glass doors, but she'd abandoned any pretense of appearing human. Her body flickered between solid and see-through, and her proportions changed constantly as though she couldn't maintain a stable appearance. When she moved, her feet made no sound on the carpet, and the fluorescent lights dimmed automatically as she approached the front desk. Charlie appeared beside her without entering through the doors, his see-through body more solid than I'd seen before. His appearance had stabilized into something that looked almost real, but his eyes remained completely black, and his voice carried harmonics that suggested multiple speakers talking in unison. "Tiberius grow weak, little guardian," Sarah announced, her voice layered with frequencies that made my teeth ache. "Tonight, we reclaim what has always belonged to us." I stood behind the front desk, with the iron salt mixture within easy reach, keeping my flashlight trained on both entities. The bright beam caused their forms to waver and lose cohesion, confirming that artificial light remained an effective deterrent. "Tonight, I'm sealing room 371 permanently," I said, surprised by how my voice sounded. "I'm cutting off your anchor point and trapping you where you can't hurt anyone else." Sarah's laugh was harsh and grating, like metal scraping against metal. Her body started changing more dramatically, her arms and legs stretching into something spider-like, while her torso got impossibly thin. The business clothes she wore hung loose on a frame that didn't look human anymore. "You think you understand our nature, but you know nothing of our true strength. We have fed here for over a century, claimed dozens of guardians grown powerful beyond your comprehension. Charlie moved closer to the salt line, his multiplied voice speaking in perfect harmony with Sarah's words. Where his feet approached the iron-enhanced barrier, wisps of smoke rose from the carpet and a smell like burning metal filled the lobby. The others thought they could contain us, too. They learned the futility of resistance when we claimed their essence, added their voices to our chorus of servants, scattered iron filings across the marble countertop, creating a defensive barrier between myself and the entities. Both Sarah and Charlie recoiled from the metallic particles, their forms becoming less stable as the iron disruptor of our energy allowed them to manifest in this space. The difference is, I'm not trying to contain you anymore. I'm going to bind you permanently to your anchor point and seal it off completely. No more feeding, no more claiming victims, no more spreading beyond this building. Sarah's form dissolved entirely for a moment before reforming several feet away. Now, more shadow than substance. Her voice became a layered whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The elevator shaft extends beyond physical space, little guardian. We exist in dimensions that follow different rules. You cannot seal what exists outside your reality. I checked the lobby clock and saw it was 3:10 a.m. 3 minutes until the isolation period began. 3 minutes until the entities would be at their strongest and most vulnerable. Instead of going back to the office, like every previous night, I grabbed my bag of iron salt mixture and headed toward the elevator. Then I'll meet you in that space and seal it from the inside. The elevators were already standing open, showing darkness that moved with purpose. The blackness inside looked deeper than it should be, and looking into it felt like staring into a pit that went down through dimensions. From that darkness came the familiar sound of human voices, Mr. Calhoun and dozens of other victims, calling my name with urgent need. He walked up to the doorway carefully, keeping the flashlight beam pointed at the opening. The light made the darkness pull back a little, creating a small, safe area near the elevator's entrance. At exactly 3:13 a.m., I poured the iron salt mixture across the doorway in a straight line, blocking the path between the elevator car and the lobby. The reaction was immediate and violent. The darkness inside the elevator pulled back with pained howling that shook the entire building, and the walls themselves seemed to twist as though the hotel was in physical pain. The iron salt barrier glowed with pale fire where it touched the supernatural darkness, creating a boundary that neither realm could cross. From the depths of that otherworldly space, a figure stumbled toward the light. Mr. Calhoun, but barely recognizable as human after weeks of captivity in whatever dimension existed beyond the elevator doors. His clothes hung in pieces on a body that had been stretched and twisted, and his skin looked see-through, suggesting he was only partially present in normal reality. "Dylan," he gasped, his voice weak but clear. "The binding symbols, draw them in the salt while the barrier holds, redirect their energy back into room 371, and seal the anchor point permanently." I pulled out the printed page of binding symbols and began drawing the geometric patterns in the iron salt mixture with my finger. Each symbol glowed briefly as I completed it, creating a complex array that seemed to pull energy from the surrounding air and focus it toward the elevator shaft. Mr. Calhoun stumbled fully into the lobby, his body becoming more solid as he moved away from the supernatural darkness. Together, we completed the binding pattern, connecting each symbol to the others with precise lines that formed a containment network extending from the elevator to room 371 directly above.
The cycle of supernatural predation had been broken at the Grand View, but the responsibility for protecting others would continue wherever darkness gathered and fed on human lives. The hotel shuddered as the binding took effect, walls groaning and lights flickering throughout the building. Sarah and Charlie's bodies began dissolving involuntarily, their essence being pulled back toward their anchor point by forces they could no longer resist. Sarah's spider-like appearance collapsed into itself, while Charlie's multiplied voice became a single desperate scream. "This will not hold forever," Sarah managed to say, as her form was dragged toward the elevator shaft. "Others will come, other guardians will fail. We are patient beyond your understanding. Then they'll find empty rooms in ordinary elevators," I replied, watching the entities disappear into the darkness that was already beginning to contract and fade. The elevator doors slammed shut hard, sealing the supernatural space away from normal reality. The binding symbols kept glowing for several minutes before fading to leave permanent marks burned into the carpet, a visible reminder of the barrier that now contained the entities permanently within their anchor point. Mr. Calhoun collapsed into one of the lobby chairs, his body gradually becoming more solid and human as the supernatural influence faded from his system. He looked older than his 47 years, but his eyes were clear and focused for the first time since his disappearance. "It's done," he said simply. "The binding will hold as long as the physical barriers remain intact, but someone will need to monitor the containment, ensure the seals don't weaken over time." By dawn, I had called James Wilson and explained enough of the situation to get his help with the permanent containment measures. We used industrial adhesive to seal the elevator doors, then installed a steel plate over the entire opening. Room 371's door was welded shut with help from a contractor. James knew who didn't ask questions about unusual requests. The salt line in the lobby was replaced with a permanent iron strip embedded directly into the carpet, creating a barrier that couldn't be easily removed or damaged. The binding symbols were covered with clear protective coating, preserving them as part of the containment system. I submitted my resignation to Rebecca before she arrived for her morning shift, citing personal reasons that required me to leave immediately.